Today we are going to be talking about a group of people who have really captured popular culture. They've been ancient explorers, warriors, and even conquerors. We're going to be talking about the Vikings. Not a lot of sun, so it's really hard to grow anything there. So a lot of Vikings actually went as settlers to Britain because of its close vicinity to Scandinavia to settle there and create farms. These settlers caused a lot of problems for the Britons because they weren't a unified kingdom like we know them today. There were actually a number of smaller kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, Wales, and Wessex. And they were warring between themselves, so when the Vikings invaded, they were kind of distracted and they had no unified force to fight back against these invading Vikings. The Vikings landed on the east coast of the British Isles and in northern Scotland because it was simply the first place that they arrived from Scandinavia, and they started to take over farms that were already occupied by Britons. So this caused war between the Britons, the English people, and the Vikings. This war continued for years, and it even gave rise to saga legends like Ivar the Boneless. But in 1886, under Alfred the Great, the King of Wessex, and the Danish leader Guthrum, they decided to create something called Dane Law. Dane Law was actually a treaty between the English and the Vikings, saying that they were going to stop fighting, live in harmony and peace, and prosper together. This didn't happen at all. They continued fighting with each other all the way until 1066, when William the Conqueror unified all the kingdoms of England, and he told the Vikings, you can either integrate into the English or leave. William the Conqueror is actually a very interesting fellow. He is the ancestor to almost all of the current ruling houses of Europe, the royal houses, but he actually has Viking heritage himself through his great-great-grandfather Rollo, who was a Viking. And Rollo went to France and he married someone called Giselle of France when he was trying to conquer France and raid France. This made him the Duke of Normandy. So Rollo is actually an ancestor to most of the royal houses of Europe. The Vikings were really keen on settling other places, so they went to places like Ireland and they created modern-day cities like Dublin, Cork, Limerick, and there were even records of Vikings going down into northern Africa and settling there, as well as in the Mediterranean. There was even a group of Vikings who went down south into Europe, what's known as Eastern Europe today, and they were traders, but they became known as the Rus. And this group of people inhabited places of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. They even created the modern-day cities of Novgorod and Kiev today. Now, these Vikings are such great travelers, but how are they actually getting around? Well, they were really good at building ships. They would build ships with flat bases, and they were called long ships. But the front of the ship would have a dragon's head, the sides would have your shields, and at the back you would have a serpent's tail. Now, you can imagine being on the shore and seeing this dragon coming towards your land, and then these giant men with battle axes coming and attacking you. It must have been terrifying. Now, the Vikings weren't a unified state. In fact, they were sort of a semi-empire. They didn't have one main king. They, in fact, had kinglings or jarls. And the jarl is actually where we get the English name earl from, which is equal to a European count. But anyone could become jarl. You didn't have to have a lineage. You could challenge your jarl to become the jarl of your village. So it was a really unstable place to rule. Now, how do we know all of this stuff? Well, like most history, through text and archaeology. However, a lot of it is guesswork when it comes to the Vikings. That being said, the Vikings did leave a lot behind, especially with the traders. They were farmers as well, and they were warriors, so they left a lot behind for us to discover who they really were. Now, how about these texts? Well, a lot of what's written about the Vikings actually came post-Viking age in the 13th century through Christian monks in Iceland. And they were just literally speaking to the people who were living in Iceland and writing down their oral history. And this is where we get all of the information from the Norse gods, the mythology, and the Viking sagas. That being said, the Vikings did have their own script called Rune, but they didn't really write down a lot of the history. It was more like, I go here, I steal sheep. So it wasn't a great source of information. So luckily we had these Christian monks writing about the Icelandic and Viking culture. But they wrote these sagas, and these sagas aren't fact, they're fiction. So also that isn't a great source of information. It's not very reliable. The Vikings did use their runic writing though, and in fact there's runic graffiti in the Hagia Sophia, the modern-day Istanbul, and we know this through the Byzantine records, that the Vikings were part of a group called the Vigarian Guard, which were an elite bodyguard group for the Byzantine emperor. So they were mercenaries. You could hire out these warriors. A stereotypical Viking would be a big person with red hair or blonde hair, have a big long beard, a battle axe or a sword, and a helmet with horns on it, but this wasn't really true. The horns never existed. In fact, it was because of Wagner, the playwright, that these horns existed, to make the Vikings at the back of the stage stick out so you could see them better from the audience. Interestingly, the Vikings were actually the ancient equivalent of modern-day feminists. They wanted equality for all, so females could even rule, which was unheard of back then. There's even famous people from sagas like Lagertha, who was the husband of Ragnar Lodbrok, and she became a ruler in her own right. All in all, the Vikings were actually quite family-orientated. They would have homes called longhouses, and these longhouses were built with stone or wood or whatever was available to them at that time. Now, these houses were literally just one long big room, and your whole family would live in there. But during the winter, you would have your animals living in there as well. Remember, a lot of the Vikings were farmers. So you would have your animals living on one side, you and your family living on the other side, and in the middle, you would have a fire for light, for heat, and for cooking things as well. Apparently you would have a hole in the roof so the smoke could go out, but during the winter times you would close that hole because it would get cold, so it would be really smoky and stinky in there with all the animals as well. Now, the Viking men and women weren't just warriors. They were also interested in fashion, and they loved to look good. So they combed their hair every day. They dyed their clothes with vegetables and plants to get these fantastic colors. And if you were wealthy, you could trade on the Silk Road to get silk. They would also like jewelry, and a lot of the jewelry was made out of bronze or bone. And if you were wealthy, you could have jewelry made out of gold or silver. Their jewelry was often in the form of pendants praising their gods, and these Vikings literally had a pantheon of gods. They were polytheistic, and if you haven't been living under a rock for the past few years, you would know some of them: Odin, Thor, Loki, and Frigg. Odin was the main man. He was the big boy, the king of the gods, and he was the ruler of Asgard. He was their number one leader. He was always looking for wisdom, and he gave his eye for wisdom. He stabbed himself with a spear of wisdom, and he hung himself for 9 days looking for wisdom, and apparently it worked for him, but I wouldn't try it. Thor, Odin and Frigg's son, probably the most well-known of the gods. He wielded a hammer called Mjolnir, and he was the protector of humanity. He was a powerful god of thunder, but apparently he wasn't very intelligent, so he would often lose his hammer. He would have a bad temper, but he was very brave and a very strong warrior, so the Vikings really looked up to him because of these qualities. Then we get to Loki. He was the trickster. He was able to shape-shift, change the way he looked, and apparently, if anything had been stolen in Asgard, they would go straight to Loki and see, right, okay, Loki, give it back. Or Loki was really intelligent, and he was able to find out whoever actually stole something in Asgard. So he was like a tricky criminal minds detective god. Frigg, Odin's wife, Thor's mother, and she was literally the queen of Asgard. She was the goddess of households and all things domestic, as well as fertility, along with Freya. And they were literally the goddesses, Freya and Frigg, of all life on Earth. And apparently, if Frigg wasn't in Asgard, all hell would be raised in Asgard. Everything would fall apart. These Norse gods even gave their names to the days of the week. In English, we have Wednesday or Odin's Day, Woden's Day. We have Thursday, Thor's Day, and Friday, Frigg's Day. Viking humans, being so fighty, believed that if they were going to die in battle or in a brave way, it would be an access way to go to Valhalla to join their gods in a giant hall with endless parties and food, having battles with no death, and it was literally Viking paradise. There are so many sagas and stories about the Vikings. They were literally just a group of people who did what they wanted. They raided, they traveled, they settled, they made sure that their lives continued. After the Viking Age, people continued to live in Scandinavia, and it turned into 3 kingdoms: Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The Vikings never disappeared. They just evolved into modern-day people, like all of our ancestors have evolved. Thank you very much for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, follow the links for more videos down below, and the more you know.